"Excuse me, sir. This isn't economy. You don't belong here." Her voice wasn't polite this time. It was sharp, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. The flight attendant towered over him, glaring down as if he had snuck into forbidden territory. "This seat is for first-class passengers only," she sneered, her eyes scanning him up and down, pausing just long enough on his skin to make her meaning obvious. "You need to get up and move to the back, where you actually belong." Gasps and murmurs spread like wildfire through the cabin. A few passengers smirked, others looked away in embarrassment, but no one said a word. The man she humiliated didn't flinch. He sat still, ticket in hand, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. The insult was blatant, the assumption undeniable. To her, he was just another black man who couldn't possibly afford first class. But what she didn't know was who he truly was. And with a single phone call, calm, quiet, devastating, he would bring the entire plane to a halt, unravel her arrogance, and show everyone on board the real cost of prejudice. What would you have done if you were sitting there, just a few rows away? Would you have spoken up, challenged her words, or stayed silent, hoping the moment would pass? These are the moments that reveal more than just a person's seat on a plane. They reveal dignity, prejudice, and the courage or silence of those who witness it. And before we go any further, I want to ask you directly, how would you have handled this? Leave your thoughts in the comments below because your voice matters here. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another true account where arrogance collides with accountability and justice finally wins. Because this isn't just a story about a flight. It's a story about respect, power, and what happens when someone in the world wrong tries to strip another of their place. James Carter was a man who carried power the way some men carry a book, quietly, without fanfare, but always close at hand. He was the governor of his state, yet if you passed him in an airport terminal, you might not notice anything extraordinary. He dressed simply, a navy blazer, pressed but not flashy, a shirt without a tie, the kind of clothes any hard-working traveller might wear on a Friday evening flight home. But for those who looked more closely, there was something unmistakable in the way he carried himself. His stride was calm, his posture deliberate, his gaze steady. He walked like a man used to having weight on his shoulders, but never letting it bend him. At the gate, he didn't stand apart. He didn't demand special treatment. He waited like everyone else, ticket tucked neatly in his hand, eyes scanning the crowd. He noticed the way people glanced at him, some with curiosity, others with quiet recognition. A few nodded respectfully, as if they knew exactly who he was, but he returned every glance with the same gentle acknowledgement, the kind that says, "I see you. I'm one of you." James Carter wasn't the kind of politician who thrived on cameras and soundbites. His reputation came from listening. He was known for walking into community centres unannounced, for sitting down at kitchen tables with families who never thought they'd be heard, for shaking the hand of a janitor with the same sincerity he'd give to a senator. Power had not made him unreachable. It had only made him more determined to remain close. That night, though, he wasn't Governor Carter. He was simply a man heading home. The week had been long, late-night policy debates, meetings stacked back to back, endless calls with advisers. His staff had urged him to take a private jet, but he refused. Taxpayers, he insisted, shouldn't foot the bill for his comfort. Commercial flights were fine. First class was a small upgrade, but one he paid for personally. For him, it was never about luxury. It was about space to review documents, a chance to rest his mind before the work waiting on the other side. The boarding call echoed through the terminal. He rose from his seat, blending into the line of passengers. Around him, people fidgeted with phones, clutched boarding passes, ushered children forward. He moved with unhurried grace, greeting the gate attendant with a polite smile. She scanned his ticket without hesitation, offered a nod, and waved him through. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, The air grew warmer, heavier. The hum of the plane vibrated beneath his shoes. Ahead, the narrow aisle of the aircraft stretched out, lined with faces that turned briefly before returning to their own distractions. James found his seat, 2A, by the window, the cushion broad, the headrest high. He slid his carry-on neatly overhead, then lowered himself into the chair, exhaling a long, quiet breath. For a moment, he allowed himself stillness. The kind of stillness he never found in the governor's mansion, never in the Capitol building, never in the constant rush of politics. Here, in this seat, he was simply a traveller. Yet even here, the world was watching him, though not in the way he deserved. A businessman 2 rows back gave him a long, assessing stare. A woman across the aisle clutched her handbag a little tighter as she shifted. He'd grown accustomed to it, the subtle weight of suspicion that came with being a black man in spaces where he wasn't expected, or in the minds of some, wasn't supposed, to be. He had faced it since his youth, through college, through campaigns, through years of public service. Each time, he met it with the same steady resolve. Dignity, above all. And so he sat, straight-backed, hands resting loosely on his lap, eyes fixed on the runway beyond the window. The seatbelt sign chimed. Passengers shuffled, attend. Dance moved briskly. He was ready for nothing more than a quiet flight home. But prejudice doesn't wait for permission. It finds its moment, and it strikes without warning. And as the footsteps approached, heels clicking sharply down the aisle, James Carter had no idea that within minutes his patience, his composure, and his very identity would be tested in front of an entire cabin of witnesses. The steady rhythm of boarding slowed, and the cabin began to settle. Luggage compartments clicked shut, passengers adjusted pillows, and the low murmur of conversation filled the air. James Carter remained in his seat, eyes calm, fingers resting lightly on the armrest. For a moment, he believed he would have the peace he had been craving all week. But peace rarely lasted long when prejudice lingered close by. He heard the footsteps first, sharp, decisive taps of polished shoes striking the narrow aisle. Then came the shadow that fell across him. He looked up to find a flight attendant standing rigidly at his side. Her arms were folded neatly behind her back, but her expression was anything but neat. Her lips pressed thin, her brow creased ever so slightly, and in her eyes burned that familiar mix of authority and suspicion. "Sir," she said, her tone clipped, professional on the surface, but dripping with judgment underneath. "May I see your boarding pass again?" James didn't flinch. He reached calmly into his blazer pocket, retrieved the ticket, and held it out. His hand was steady, deliberate. She took it between her manicured fingers, studied it for a moment, then let her gaze flick quickly from the paper back to him, as though something didn't match. "This seat," she said, her voice louder now, "is reserved for first-class passengers. I believe you may be in the wrong place." The words hung heavy in the air. A man across the aisle lifted his head from his newspaper, a Waisi. A young woman further back pulled out her earbuds, suddenly interested. The space around them seemed to tighten, every passenger sensing that something unusual was unfolding. James kept his composure. He didn't snap, didn't bristle. "That is my seat," he replied softly. "Seat 2A. The attendant's smile curved, but it was the kind of smile sharpened into a blade. "I see the number, but are you certain you purchased first class?" Her voice carried, and the phrasing was deliberate. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge, one that reached the ears of everyone nearby. The whispers started almost immediately. A man in the 3rd row leaned toward his companion. "Did you hear that?" A teenager craned his neck to get a better look. The air seemed to grow heavier with every second she stood there, her body language radiating disbelief that a man like him could belong where he sat. James inhaled slowly through his nose, then exhaled, grounding himself in that steady patience he had cultivated his entire life. "Yes," he answered, his voice even. "This seat was purchased, and it is mine." But she wasn't satisfied. She bent down slightly, lowering her voice, though not enough to keep others from hearing. "Look," she said, her tone shifting from falsely sweet to edged with irritation. "I've worked this route for years. I know who sits up here, and I don't want to have to embarrass you. The economy cabin has plenty of space. Why don't we avoid a scene and get you resettled?" Avoid a scene. Yet she was the one crafting it. James said nothing. His eyes returned to the window, his jaw tightening just enough to betray the tension he kept carefully locked inside. The silence unsettled her. She straightened, huffed, and looked around as if searching for support from the audience of passengers. And in a way she found it, not in words, but in the silence of those who did not intervene. People shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes, others pretending to be lost in their phones. No one spoke. No one challenged her. And in that silence, she grew bolder. She leaned in again, her tone now cutting, dismissive. "Sir, first class isn't open seating. It's not for people who think they can just walk in. You're going to have to move before boarding is complete." This time, gasps slipped into the air. A woman further down muttered, "That's not right." Another passenger shook his head, but still no one rose to stop it. James's fingers tapped lightly on the armrest. It wasn't agitation, it was a reminder to himself. Patience. Always patience. He had been humiliated before, in public, in private, in moments when prejudice reared its head like a storm cloud, and every time he chose the same response. Calm dignity. Not because he was weak, but because he knew real power didn't need to shout. He turned back to her, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those watching. "This is my seat," he said, "and I will remain here." Her lips thinned further, her face flushing slightly, as though she couldn't comprehend his refusal to bend. "Then I'll have to involve the captain," she snapped. The tension crackled like static in the air. The businessman too rose back, shook his head, whispering, "This is ridiculous." A mother tried to distract her child, who stared wide-eyed at the confrontation. The cabin had become a stage. Every passenger an unwilling witness to a drama that revealed more than one woman's prejudice. It revealed the quiet complicity of those who let it unfold. James leaned back against the seat, his expression unreadable. Inside, the sting of her words pressed against old wounds, wounds carved long before this flight. Wounds he had carried from childhood through manhood, through every room where he had been doubted, dismissed, or diminished. But he would not give her the satisfaction of seeing it break him. So he remained silent. The flight attendant straightened once more, ticket still clutched in her hand, and strode briskly toward the galley. Her heels struck the floor in quick, irritated bursts. Passengers exhaled in unison, as though a storm cloud had briefly passed. Yet the air remained thick with unease. Whispers rose again, speculation weaving through the cabin like smoke. Why would she say that? Doesn't she know who he is? She doesn't care. She just thinks he doesn't belong. James Carter heard it all, though he kept his gaze fixed firmly on the horizon beyond the window. The runway stretched out like a promise of escape, but he knew he could not escape prejudice so easily. Not here, not tonight. And as the flight attendant prepared to return, armed now with the authority of her uniform and the arrogance of her assumptions, the humiliation would only deepen. But James Carter had no intention of shouting her down. He would let her words pile high, let her actions draw the crowd's gaze sharper and sharper, until the weight of her prejudice collapsed under its own arrogance. Because what she didn't know, what no one on that plane yet realized, was that the quiet man in seat 2A held far more authority than anyone on board. And with one simple choice, one quiet call, he would turn this moment of humiliation into a lesson no one would forget. James Carter sat still in his seat, his body language unchanged, his face a mask of patience. To the untrained eye, it looked as though he had accepted the humiliation in silence, shrinking into the role the flight attendant had assigned him. But anyone who truly knew him, anyone who had watched him navigate storms fiercer than this, would recognize the truth. He was waiting, calculating, choosing his moment. The flight attendant had retreated for now, muttering to colleagues in the galley, glancing back at him with thinly veiled disdain. She believed she had won. To her, he was just another passenger who would eventually bow to authority. She didn't realize that true authority was sitting in 2A, quiet and deliberate. James reached for his phone. His movements were unhurried, almost casual, as though he were checking emails or scrolling through the day's news. Passengers nearby noticed but dismissed it. After all, everyone reached for their phones during boarding. Nothing about it seemed unusual. But beneath the screen's glow, his fingers moved with precision. He typed a brief message, no more than a line. On board. Incident developing. Crew misconduct. Delay immediate response. He hit send. That single message leapt across secure channels, landing in the hands of people who did not see James Carter as just another man on a plane. They saw him as their governor, the elected leader of millions, a man with security protocols woven around his every step. Moments later, his phone vibrated with a response. Acknowledged. Standing by. Plane will not leave gate until cleared. He exhaled slowly, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. Not one of triumph, but of quiet certainty. Justice was already moving, unseen, unstoppable. Around him, passengers settled into their seats. A businessman barked into his phone about deals waiting on the West Coast. A child clutched a stuffed rabbit, whispering questions to her mother. Flight attendants bustled up and down the aisle, securing overhead bins and reminding people to fasten seatbelts. The ordinary rhythm of pre-flight continued, wrapping the cabin in a false sense of normalcy. But James knew better. He could already feel the gears shifting, the invisible weight pressing down on the situation. The flight attendant had no idea. She strode past him again, her posture stiff, her eyes lingering on him with a flicker of irritation, as though he were a splinter she couldn't remove. To her, the matter was unresolved. To him, it was already over. She stopped beside his row, leaning just enough to make her presence felt. "We're still waiting for clearance," she said curtly, though she didn't mention that he was the reason the clearance had vanished. "Enjoy that. Your seat while you can." James didn't respond. He glanced briefly at her, then lowered his gaze back to his phone. His silence was louder than any retort, and it unsettled her more than an argument ever could. She shifted, straightened, and moved on, her shoulders tense. The whispers around the cabin grew. A man leaned toward his seatmate. "Why are we still sitting here?" Another passenger checked his watch, muttering about connections. The delay was subtle at first, but it spread like ripples across the water. People sensed something wasn't right. Minutes ticked by. 10, 15, 20. The engines never roared to life. The plane remained stubbornly still at the gate, and with each passing moment, passengers grew more restless, their curiosity sharp as knives. James Carter sat unmoved. His stillness was its own statement, a quiet defiance that contrasted starkly with the rising tension around him. While others shifted, fidgeted, or sighed in frustration, he remained centered, as if anchored in calm waters no storm could shake. What no one realized was that his calm wasn't passive. It was power. Every second of delay was a thread tightening around the arrogance of one woman who believed she had the right to strip him of dignity. Some passengers began to piece things together. A woman whispered, "It's because of what happened earlier, isn't it?" A man shook his head in disbelief. If that's true, they're in big trouble. And yet, the flight attendant moved through the cabin with the same practiced authority, offering drinks, checking seatbelts, pretending nothing was wrong. But beneath her controlled exterior, nerves flickered. Her glances toward the cockpit grew more frequent. She adjusted her scarf, her posture, her smile, all betraying the faint crack of unease. James Carter noticed. He noticed everything. He had built a career on reading people, on discerning not just what they said, but what they meant, what they feared, what they tried desperately to hide. And here, in this plane, he saw the beginning of her unraveling. His phone vibrated once more. A brief update flashed across the screen. Captain informed. Crew aware. Action pending. He locked the phone, placed it on the armrest, and folded his hands neatly over his lap. To everyone else, it looked like he was merely waiting, enduring the delay like the rest. But inside, he knew the tide had turned. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The hum of whispered speculation filled the cabin, louder than any announcement could have been. And still, James Carter sat steady, a storm contained behind calm eyes. Because in just a few more minutes, the truth would arrive at 30,000 feet, before the plane ever left the ground. And when it did, no one in that cabin would ever forget the lesson that prejudice, arrogance, and misplaced authority were about to learn the hard way. The minutes had stretched unbearably long, the air inside the cabin thick with suspicion and whispers. People shifted in their seats, wondering why the plane had yet to back away from the gate. The flight attendant, still composed on the surface, carried herself with that same clipped professionalism, but her eyes darted toward the cockpit more often now, betraying the first cracks of unease. Then something shifted. The cockpit door opened. The captain stepped out, his uniform pressed sharp, his expression controlled but tense. In his hand was a phone, an airline-issued device rarely seen outside the flight deck. He scanned the cabin slowly, as if searching for someone, and when his eyes landed on 2A, his gaze held. Governor James Carter didn't move. He remained seated, hands folded calmly on his lap, his phone resting dark on the armrest. To every passenger watching, it looked like nothing more than a man waiting out a delay. But when the captain's jaw tightened, when he straightened his cap and walked down the aisle toward him, the atmosphere shifted like the air before a storm. The murmurs began. "Wait, who is he? Why's the captain coming out? Something's going on." The flight attendant, the very one who had insisted James didn't belong in first class, froze halfway through the cabin. Her practiced smile faltered, her hand tightening on the service cart until her knuckles whitened. She looked between the captain and James, confusion flickering into dread. The captain stopped beside 2A. His voice, low but carrying enough to be overheard, broke the tension. "Governor Carter," he said, "we've been informed. My apologies for the delay. We're working to resolve this immediately." The word governor cut through the air like glass, shattering on tile. Passengers stiffened, their eyes widening, the whispers escalating into open astonishment. "Governor? Did he just say governor? Oh my God, it's him. That's Governor Carter." The revelation rippled through the cabin, the balance of power tilting in an instant. What had seemed like one man quietly enduring humiliation was now revealed as the highest elected official of the state, a leader sitting humbly among them. The flight attendant's face drained of color, her lips parted, but no words came. She took a half step forward, then stopped, her posture shrinking as the realization set in. This wasn't a passenger she could dismiss. This wasn't a man she could shuffle to the back with a smug sense of authority. She had challenged the governor himself. James looked up at the captain, his expression still composed, his voice even. "Thank you, Captain," he said quietly. "I trust the situation will be handled appropriately." There was no need for raised tones, no need for spectacle. His very presence, coupled with the captain's deference, spoke louder than anything else. It was a moment of exposure, not just for the attendant, but for everyone who had watched in silence, unsure whether to intervene. The passengers leaned in, their eyes shifting between the calm man in 2A and the attendant who, see, arrogance had ignited this fire. Judgment lingered in their stares. Some were appalled, others visibly ashamed they hadn't spoken up sooner. A few even nodded subtly in support, recognizing the dignity with which James had carried himself throughout the ordeal. The captain straightened, his gaze flicking briefly toward the attendant. His words were clipped, professional, but edged with steel. "Ms. Andrews, a word. Now." She hesitated, her feet rooted to the carpet. The weight of every eye on her seemed to pin her in place, but the authority in the captain's tone left no room for defiance. She turned, her movement stiff, and followed him toward the galley, where the hushed but unmistakable cadence of reprimand carried faintly back into the cabin. James remained where he was, serene, as though the storm had passed directly over him without touching him. Yet around him, passengers now saw him differently. No longer the quiet man silently enduring an insult, but the governor, whose restraint had revealed the arrogance of another. Moments later, the captain returned to his post, addressing James once more with a respectful nod. "We'll be departing shortly, Governor. Again, my apologies." James inclined his head. "Thank you." And that was all. No gloating, no display of vengeance, no satisfaction carved into his expression. Just calm acceptance, a steady presence that spoke of leadership rooted not in power, but in principle. The whispers among passengers didn't die down, though. If anything, they swelled into something heavier. They were not just gossip anymore. They were witness. Witness to prejudice unmasked, to dignity prevailing, to the sharp reminder that status doesn't grant respect, but character does. For the flight attendant, the unraveling had just begun. She returned to the aisle with her posture diminished, her every movement stripped of the confidence she had carried minutes earlier. The mask of control was gone, and though she tried to avoid James Carter's gaze, the memory of his silence, his patience, and now his revealed authority hung over her like a shadow that could not be shaken. What no one knew yet was that the true consequences were still ahead. The cabin had seen the shift in power, but beyond these walls, a far greater reckoning was waiting. Because this wasn't just a mistake on a plane. This was an act that would echo far beyond this flight, costing more than one woman her pride. And as the doors finally closed and the engines hummed to life, every passenger on board understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was no ordinary flight, and the man in 2A was no ordinary passenger. The engines hummed louder, the cabin lights dimmed to prepare for takeoff, but the plane did not move. Minutes ticked by, long enough for tension to build again. Not the sharp, personal kind that had hung in the air before, but something heavier, institutional. Everyone could feel it. Something far larger was unfolding, and the delay was no longer mechanical or routine. Then came the announcement, the captain's voice steady, but carrying a weight passengers were unaccustomed to hearing. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be pausing our departure briefly. Thank you for your patience." Polite, professional, but the coded message was clear. This flight wasn't going anywhere until the situation inside the cabin was resolved. The whispers reignited like sparks in dry grass. Passengers craned their necks, some discreetly raising their phones, recording the tense air around 2A. What had started as a private insult was now bleeding into something public, something documented, something that could not be buried under silence. The flight attendant who had started it all stood at the front galley, stiff as a statue, her forced poise unraveling second by second. Her earlier confidence had vanished. Her eyes flicked toward James Carter, but darted away instantly, as if his calm presence were a mirror she could not bear to face. And then came the call. Not James's phone this time, but the captain's device, buzzing with a priority connection from the airline's corporate chain. Passengers caught fragments, saw the captain nodding sharply, his expression tightening. Within minutes, another announcement followed, this one laced with formality that could not mask the undercurrent of crisis. "We appreciate your patience, ladies and gentlemen. We've been directed to remain at the gate a little longer while we coordinate with ground control and airline leadership." Translation. The situation had left the cabin. It was now in the hands of executives, regulators, and legal teams scrambling to control the damage. Passengers recorded more. A young woman in row 4 whispered to her neighbor, "This is going viral. No way this doesn't end up online tonight." She was right. By then, snippets of the incident were already leaving the cabin through quiet uploads, ready to ignite a storm the company could not contain. The airline had a problem, and it had a name: Governor James Carter. By the time the plane's door reopened, with ground staff stepping back inside, the hierarchy was inverted. The governor sat silently in 2A, still dignified, still calm. The flight attendant, however, was summoned forward, pulled gently but firmly by her supervisor. She resisted at first, whispering fast, desperate explanations. But her words were lost under the weight of what everyone already knew. The balance had shifted beyond her reach. Passengers leaned in as the door closed behind her, sealing her fate outside the cabin. A hush fell over the plane. The silence of people realizing they had witnessed the fall of someone who only minutes ago had wielded authority with smug certainty. The plane EV eventually departed, but the story didn't wait for landing. By the time wheels touched the runway at their destination, social media feeds were ablaze. Clips of the confrontation spread like wildfire, snippets of the attendant's condescending tone, the captain's address to Governor Carter, the murmurs of shock from passengers as the truth came out. The backlash was instant. Hashtags calling for accountability trended within hours. Comment sections seethed with outrage, not just at the attendant's behavior, but at the pattern it represented. The disbelief that a black man could rightfully belong in a seat of privilege, let alone power. The airline scrambled. Their first statement, released hastily within the day, spoke of miscommunication and standard procedures. But the public wasn't fooled, and the governor himself had said nothing, his silence sharper than any press release. By day 2, corporate headquarters was in damage control. Executives convened emergency meetings, legal teams drafted careful apologies, and internal memos acknowledged what the public already demanded: accountability. The attendant, once proud in her uniform, was suspended pending investigation. Behind closed doors, her emails and incident reports were dissected, every detail scrutinized. It became clear her language had not been procedural, it had been personal. The subtext was undeniable, and the company knew it. She wasn't just a rogue employee. She was a liability threatening their reputation. Termination followed swiftly. The airline issued a second statement, this one heavy with contrition. "We deeply regret the incident that occurred on Flight 227. The conduct displayed does not reflect our values of respect, inclusion, and dignity for all passengers. We have extended a personal apology to Governor Carter and are taking immediate steps to ensure this never happens again." But the apology rang hollow for many. It wasn't the company's values that had been on display that day. It was the flight attendant's unchecked prejudice, pounded by the silence of those who should have intervened sooner. As the headlines multiplied, Governor Carter finally broke his silence with a single, steady statement. "This was never about me. This was about what too many people face every day in quieter, less public spaces. No one should be judged unworthy of dignity based on the color of their skin or the seat they occupy." His words, calm as always, cut deeper than outrage ever could. They transformed the incident from a scandal into a lesson, a story of leadership under pressure, of prejudice unmasked, of consequences that reached beyond one woman's career. For the attendant, the fallout was total. Her name, once hidden behind a corporate shield, leaked into forums and articles, her face attached to the incident she had created. The job was gone, the uniform stripped, the future uncertain. And while some pitied her, Most agreed. She had authored her own downfall the moment she chose arrogance over respect. For the airline, the consequences stretched further still. Boycotts, shareholder questions, promises of reform. The incident became a case study in corporate accountability, a reminder that injustice, when exposed, reverberates beyond the walls where it began. And for the passengers, the memory lingered, a story they would retell for years. They had witnessed arrogance collapse into humility and dignity rise in silence. But the lesson belonged to everyone. Injustice, no matter how small it seems in the moment, carries weight. And when dignity meets arrogance, truth has a way of leveling the scales. What no one on that plane could deny was this. The balance of power had shifted forever the moment one calm man in seat 2A chose silence over anger and patience over pride. When the dust finally settled, James Carter did not seek revenge. He did not stand before cameras demanding apologies or parading his authority. He did what he had always done. He carried himself with quiet dignity. To the outside world, it might have looked like he won a battle. The airline humbled, the attendant dismissed, the story echoing across headlines and feeds. But to him, victory wasn't in the humiliation of another. It was in showing that dignity can hold its ground, even in the face of arrogance and prejudice. As he later told reporters, power doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it's simply knowing when not to raise your voice. Those who had sat near him remembered the calm in his face as the storm swirled around him, the stillness in his hands, the steadiness in his posture. He had not lashed out, had not thrown words like weapons. He had waited, and in waiting, the truth revealed itself. That is the nature of real power. It does not need to shout to be heard. The flight attendant's downfall became a headline. The airline's apology became a statement. But Governor Carter's composure became a lesson, a reminder that every day countless people face moments of doubt, suspicion, and quiet exclusion, not always on airplanes, not always in first-class cabins, but in workplaces, classrooms, and neighborhoods. And in those moments, the choice is ours. Do we answer arrogance with fury, or do we let dignity do the work of justice? Do we perpetuate the cycle of humiliation, or do we rise above it, forcing others to confront their prejudice in the light of calm truth? James Carter chose dignity. And because he did, the world saw more than just a governor being mistreated. They saw the reflection of countless injustices endured by those without titles, without authority, without the luxury of viral cameras to hold others accountable. His silence gave them a voice. And so, as the plane finally reached its destination and passengers disembarked, the governor walked out the same way he had walked in, measured, unshaken, and resolute. Behind him the murmurs of the crowd lingered, a mix of awe and reflection. Because what they had witnessed was not just a man in power reclaiming his seat. They had seen how justice can arrive quietly but firmly, how respect belongs to every passenger, no matter their skin, their title, or their place in society. And as you hear this story now, ask yourself, in that moment, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have stood for dignity? Remember this, every choice carries weight. Every word, every glance, every assumption either builds or breaks the world we share. And sometimes the strongest stand you can take is to sit still and let the truth rise on its own.